Hey there, welcome to another exciting edition of Tutorials on the Go. We are going to discuss another topic in accounting called business documentation. We're going to look at the various documentations that we need in accounting to make it a smooth process. Accounting, as we said in our first lecture, is the recording, the classifying, summarizing of financial information. And you need this documentation to assist you in that. Let's move straight into our discussion. What are business documentation? So these are physical bases upon which business transactions are recorded. So they are mainly retained for use as evidence for later review of a company's financial resources, especially during an audit. It is also a verification for transaction that they indeed transpired. The documentations will prove that what has been recorded in the financial statement indeed occurred and is not just a fiction of our imagination. Now, business documentation usually contain the following information. 1. The names of the seller and the buyer. Transaction is an interaction between two people, so definitely it has to capture those names. The description of the business transaction, what really transpired to bring up the documentation. The date that the transaction transpired. The specific amount of money involved. Then an authorizing signature. Now, without an authorizing signature, the document cannot be relied upon. Okay, let's move further to look at the various documentations that we have. The first we'll look at is a quotation. Now, a quotation is also known as quotes, sales quotations. Now, these are documents a seller provides to its client, that is a buyer, informing them of its intention to offer their goods or services at a stated quantity, stated price, under specified conditions. And the quotation must be valid for a particular period. Now, the quotations are not legally binding unless they are part of an official contract. In as much as they are not legally binding, it is generally accepted that the business and the customer has committed to a sale at a specific price if they accept the quote. A sample of the quotation has been provided to the right, so take your time and study it thoroughly. We move on to talk about a purchase order, also known as a PO. It's a document written to a supplier, that is a seller, authorizing them to provide goods or services at a certain price, quantity level, date, and other terms specified in an agreement. Now, the purchase order follows the quotation. So once the seller has offered the quote or the quotation to the buyer then has to issue a PO in the terms that is stated in the quotation. Now, a PO is also used to countercheck an invoice received when the job is done. We are going to talk about invoice very soon, so don't worry. When the invoice is given out, the PO will use to cross-check because that is what I ordered you to provide. Is it the same thing that you provided that has been written on the invoice? A purchase order is legally binding after the supplier countersigns it. We now look at a sales order. So a sales order is a document generated by a seller for its internal use in processing a customer PO. So now when the seller issues a quotation, the buyer issues a PO. When the seller receives the PO is an external document coming from the buyer. It might not suit into the business's criteria or the business's documentation. So the business now has to convert it into a sales order for a variety of purposes, including approval of the order by the credit department to determine whether the company is still in the right standing to be offered credit. Second, initiation of a work order. Now, if the item now has to be produced, the sales order will give it an authorization or permission for production to start. Initiation of a picking operation. If the item has to be transported from a warehouse or to be bought from a third party, the sales order will give it the authority or the power. So we have a template of the sales order to the right. Again, kindly take your time to familiarize yourself with it. Invoice. So this is a document sent to a buyer outlining the product or services provided, especially on credit, as well as their cost and also terms of payment. So a sample of an invoice is to the right. Credit note, also known as a credit memo. It is a document issued by a seller to a buyer indicating a reduction in their debt. So this happens when there is a return of goods sold or the goods has been transported but the client has not received it and now he's decided not to go forward with the agreement. Cancellation of an invoice already sent or issued to a customer. So for example, when the invoice is sent to the customer and it is detected that there is an error on the invoice by either side, and the invoice has to be cancelled for a new one to be generated. So a sample of the credit note is shown to the right. Let's move on to talk about the debit note, also known as a debit memo. It is a commercial document issued by a buyer to a seller as a means of formally requesting a credit note. Now, when the buyer is returning an item or detects an error on the invoice, he has to issue a debit note to the seller requesting for a credit note to reduce his or her balance. A seller may also issue a debit note instead of an invoice in order to adjust upwards an amount on an invoice already issued. We'll talk about goods received note, also known as the delivery note. It is a document that serves as an evidence and represents the receipts of goods by customers. So both suppliers and customers use the goods received note to compare order and delivery quantity. When a buyer purchases goods, the seller will transport it to him or her. When you receive the goods received note will indicate all the items that were received and the shipment. Okay, so a sample is shown to the right. Remittance advice. So a remittance advice is a statement that accompanies a payment to a supplier detailing what was paid. A supplier uses this information to offset outstanding receivables in its accounting system having been paid. So a remittance advice is frequently attached to a check payment or sent separately if the payment was done via a bank transfer. Now, it involves the invoice number being paid and the amount. This document is a best practice because it saves the seller time trying to identify which invoice is being paid for by a transfer or a check. So you have a remittance advice shown to the right. Let's look at a receipt. Now, a receipt is a document issued by a seller to a buyer when something of value is transferred and paid for. So whenever you sell or buy something and you pay for it, you have to get what? A receipt. If it is on credit, you have to get what? An invoice. So the document acknowledges that the item has been received, and a receipt may contain the following information: the date of the transfer, the description of the item received, the amount paid for the item, any tax involved, or the form of payment used, whether cash, credit card, check, or a transfer. So let's look at the sample shown to the right here. A bank statement. So a bank statement is a document that is issued by a bank once a month to its customers, listing the transactions impacting the bank account. So it provides information on deposits within the month, charges, withdrawals, as well as the beginning balance and the ending balance for that particular period. So account holders generally review their bank statements every month to help keep track of expenses and spending, as well as monitor for any fraudulent charges or mistakes. So guys, we bring our discussion on business documentation to an end here. I hope you have understood or gotten knowledge of all the documentation or the item that you need whilst running your business. If you have any questions, you have any suggestions, you have any feedback, submissions, I will urge you to visit our channel on YouTube, DW Consult, and kindly drop them there and we'll address them accordingly. Whilst you do that, kindly hit the subscribe button for our activity to go far, to bring it to the attention of many people. Also hit the notification bell to get first-hand information about videos that we upload there. Thank you very much for your time and stay blessed.